Hello and welcome to the Lazar Focus. I am Lazar. I am your host on this weekly Times of Israel podcast. Now, here in this podcast, we like to dive deeper than many of you are able to do from just listening to shorter podcasts, from reading, and really bring you inside a deep discussion of some of the issues which have affected Israel until now and will really determine Israel's security, prosperity, welfare moving forward. Now, in all of these challenges, of course, no country, especially Israel, has an unlimited budget. A shekel that is spent on one place is not spent somewhere else. So a shekel that is spent on the military is not spent on welfare, education, health. And in recent decades, I've written on this, others have as well, there was a trend that money was taken out of the defense budget and put into other social priorities. Now, that doesn't automatically mean that that is the only reason why we got to the tragedy of the October 7th. Of course, you can think into Israel's and the IDF's early days, in which much less money was spent on a force that was able to attain some very, very clear victories. But today, we have, as a result of lessons from the war and what the public wants, we have the prime minister and defense minister and other leaders saying that we're going to spend hundreds of billions of shekels more on defense. Of course, that does not automatically mean that we are going to get the force, the military force that is going to be the best, the optimized force to meet the challenges that we are facing in the future. So, to discuss these very complex issues and these challenges, we are here with my friend, my former boss, and someone who many of you might have heard of. And if you haven't, I think this is a good time to get to know him, Brigadier-General Eran Ortal. Hello, Eran.
Good evening, Lazar. Great to be here.
So just as a word of introduction, Eran, he is currently at the American Foreign Policy Council, and as well, he sits at the Dado Center for Strategic Studies at Bar-Ilan University. Now, going back into his military career in the IDF, he was the commander of the IDF Dado Center for Interdisciplinary Military Studies, where I was a fellow for a few years as well. There, he was the editor of the Dado Center journal, and he really developed as one of the leading voices of critique, of checking and offering critiques of the dominant thoughts within the IDF. And he published, and you can access this yourselves, readers, if you do just search for his name, a series of very important articles with other top generals, and including future chiefs of staff, talking about the ground forces transformation, intelligence, the Iranian threat, the rockets threat, the tunnels threat. And I think most interestingly, we had an interview, if you remember, Iran, in 2023, before October 7th, which the headline was a quote of yours, which you said, "Time was not on our side." Indeed, you are proven correct that because the IDF did not make all the transformations it needed to, we certainly found ourselves in a very, very difficult war and a very difficult situation on October 7th. And I also want to say that his book, The Battle Before the War, The Inside Story of the IDF's Transformation, recently came in second place from the INSS Tshetshik Prize for Studies on Israeli Security. So congratulations to you, Iran, and thank you for being here. Can you just tell us a little bit about the book?
Thank you, Lazar. Well, the book basically summed up a work we've been doing for a decade, maybe even a decade and a half before it was published in 2022. And it was about describing the strategical failure that we were feeling that is evolving, and describing the transformation the IDF needs. And actually, back at the years 2020, 2021, there was a feeling that we are actually starting to make the essential changes, but it turned out to be too little too late.
That's right. All right. So let's go into, we're going to dive deep into these transformations and how the IDF changed and needs to change. But first, we'll take a short break from one of our sponsors.
3 million Israelis are dealing with trauma since October 7th. To help Israelis heal, Hadassah is there, with the largest rehabilitation center in Jerusalem, world-renowned medical centers, and youth villages. It's said, saving a life saves the world. Imagine helping millions. This is Hadassah, a life-changing force in Israel and and the world.
And we're back. So let's go back to the beginning. You have a young Jewish state surrounded by a series of much bigger, much more numerous Arab enemies. How does David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister, decide to create a security concept in an army that meets its security needs in its early decades?
So I think it was Israel Tal, Italic, one of our deputy chief of staff, that summed up Ben Gurion the best way. And he summed it up by saying the Israeli security doctrine is all about having a punch and avoiding attrition. That's it. And Ben Gurion once said, if I have to sum up all of the Jewish history, it will be with few words which are quality over quantity.
Yes.
So basically, the concept, the strategy was recruiting all the IDF, all of Israel's resources for a very limited period of time to have a decisive battlefield victory and go back home and try to have as long of breaking ties between the wars as you can, so you can bring on aliyah and develop the economy. So it was all about the punch and avoiding the attrition. If you limit the length of wars, you can actually enjoy your qualitative age, your organizational supremacy, and and make sure you take the war to the other side and finish it before the Arab coalition that was surrounding us had the opportunity to fulfill their qualitative potential.
Right. So this is, I understand the idea. What does that look like in practice? Does that mean most of the punching power that you talked about is in the Air Force, or is it in the ground forces? Is that where the victory is meant to come from in those early decades?
So here's the magic. In order to follow through this basic logic, Ben Gurion has realized, and the IDF has actually took it further, that you need to change the method every period of time in order to keep the principles alive. So Ben Gurion realized that the War of Independence was coming. That was in 1947. He thought about it and he realized what's gonna happen. We're gonna be invaded by regular Arab armies. So he insisted on preparing for the creation, the establishment of a regular army, the IDF. Now, it sounds trivial for us, but the Haganah chief of staff and activist wanted just to make sure that the kibbutzim in the frontiers has more weapons. They were not about, they couldn't see the future. So
Right.
the point was that in order to keep those principles, you need a constant changing. So IDF 1.0 was the establishment of the IDF. IDF 2.0 was the creation of the armored, mechanized IDF back in the 50s. Again, a lot of the senior officers of the chief of staff, of the general staff of the IDF, opposed the idea of going to tanks. They were all paratroopers and regular infantry in the Palmach. And then after Yom Kippur War, the crisis made the IDF want more tanks. We fell in love with the idea of tanks, but in the 80s, it was apparent that just having more tanks and more infantry was not the solution. So the IDF 3.0 showed its face, and that was what the Americans called the RMA, the Revolution in Military Affairs. Basically, harvesting computers and optic sensors to make a good intelligence surveillance system and accurate munition, and therefore for the few to be able to take the many, but not just through tank warfare bravely. So constant change of the military method in order to maintain the basic strategical framework. That was the magic.
Right. So if I'm going to sum that up, and you can tell me if you see it the same way, we went from this 2.0, this army that was very heavily, that relied on the speed and the maneuverability of Israel's tanks to win the famous victories in 1956, 1967, even 1973 after a very difficult start. But because of the trauma of 1973, because of the huge cost, because of our Soviet-backed enemies were able to destroy so many tanks without tanks, but with Sagar missiles, then there was a desire to change the way we fought, try to find some way where we could have less casualty-heavy wars. And wouldn't you know it, the U.S. is trying to do the same thing at the same time in Europe. They decide their advantage over the Soviets is not in numbers, but in their technological abilities. And that is very much something Israel was able to do as well. And both sides move toward investment, not in the ground forces, but in their intelligence and their air power, and create this precision ability to knock out the Soviet advantage or the Arab advantage in numbers. And that's where you see the IDF moving to in the 80s and 90s, and you start moving away from ground maneuver. Is that how you see it as well?
Exactly. Though many view that development in the 80s and 90s of the last century as it was a sin or the version from the principles of war. And it was not. It was actually very accurate, very smart move to make in the context of small military forces that will have to defend from superior forces in numbers. Here's the thing. Now, as you said, I'm a critic of where the IDF went, but I'm not a critic of the 1990s reform. I'm a critic of the fact that we did not have another one as circumstances were obviously beginning to change during those very 10 years, during the 1990s and the 2000s and so on and so forth. That military force that we have created that was able to hold back a Syrian armored invasion was not the accurate force in order to handle the true wars that we were in. In the south of Lebanon, we were fighting a new guerrilla called Hezbollah, if you
Yep.
heard of them. And later on, we had the Hamas in the Gaza Strip. And what happened is that, at first, it's a good idea. Let's try to make bets of what we have, of our advantages. So if your advantage is with good intelligence, surveillance system, and accurate precision weapons, basically from the air, why won't you try to utilize that in order to defeat the new emerging threats? The thing was that those new emerging threats were not just emerging from thin air. The response of the other side to the military supremacy that you have gathered. So Hezbollah and Hamas were all about avoiding from being a target. So with that in mind, our strategy became to be method centered, not strategy centered. And so we realized that air power cannot defeat guerrillas. So we've changed the story. We've changed the basics of our strategy. And we've stopped thinking about defeating the other side, removing the threat, having short walls, and coming back home. And we started thinking, well, maybe, I don't know what about defeat, how you can defeat such enemies, but we are so mighty, we be surely be able to change their mind.
And that's where we get to deterrence.
That's what we later call the deterrent operation. So here's the paradox. There's a confusion about how effective is your force in the battlefield. But the response for that is not to rethink about the force itself, but in the first time in our history, actually rethink a strategy. And it comes with the whole story. Maybe it's the end. What we're facing is the ending phases of the Arab-Israeli conflict. And maybe it's a peace around the corner. I mean, Hezbollah and Hamas, they're just, the last phases of the big conflict just coming to its end. And maybe Israel is not the David versus Goliath anymore. We are a regional superpower. Maybe diversely from what we've always thought, maybe we can impact and influence our neighborhood and change their mind. So appeasing came through. So it was a strategy of appeasing in the political stance. I mean, Qatari and Manning to Hamas, and looking the other way to Hezbollah build up in South Lebanon, on the one hand, and on the other hand, we're gonna burn Lebanon and we're gonna bomb Gaza, and surely they'll be deterred.
So throughout this period, I want to ask you about the reserve force. I'm a reserve officer, you're a reserve officer now. And if we're talking about the good old days where the IDF won in 6 days, the main punching power was the call up of the reserves. And once you had that 80% of the army, then you were able to go off on the offensive and win. What was happening to the reserve force, as we're not talking about ground wars anymore, we're talking about striking from the air, but we have hundreds of thousands of reservists.
So that's a very important question. And you say that was the punching force, and as we had avoided going to war in the last 3 decades, and clearly prepared those short deterrent operations and the appeasement policy, a confidence gap started to occur. A confidence gap, largely talking about our ground forces. It's quite apparent that no one wants to actually throw you into battle, and where and that in general, and it was the gap was felt at its height with the reserve forces, and that is not just about the surprise in October 7. That is not just about the fact that this policy and this strategic derailment had allowed Hezbollah and Hamas, Lebanon and Gaza, to build up those guerrilla armies that actually invaded us in October 7th. You can see the effects of that in the 2 years war that we've been engaged. You could see that, first let me say that the ground operation in the Gaza Strip were remarkably efficient. Nevertheless, they were remarkably efficient, and mainly because of an excellent intelligence and air power support that the ground forces had. And nevertheless, it took us 2 years to come to where we are now. And it took us 2 years because of many things, but we want to discuss the operational level, not the strategic and the political level. So in the operational level, the reason that this war took so long had to do with IDF ill preparedness to fight the subterranean warfare. That was a huge delay. That caused us a huge delay, and still those tunnels are partly operational. And the other thing that you could see during the war is worrying sign of inconfidence, of lack of trust between the echelons. between the fighting echelons on the ground and the general staff giving the orders from Tel Aviv. And this lack of trust is the phenomena that the IDF had never experienced. And it doesn't have to do with the people in charge today. It had to do with those 3 decades of trust erosion that we've described.
So if I'm looking back over those years, I see there was 2 big operations in the 90s against Hezbollah, which ground forces were not used, right? It was artillery and air power. 2002, maybe we have an exception, which actually made the problem worse because Operation Defensive Shield went pretty well. And then we probably said to ourselves, the ground forces are fine, even the reserves. 2006, we finally get around to using the ground forces, including reservists at the very end. But that was the last resort, and it was not used especially effectively, didn't really influence the final result. And then you have this string of deterrence operations, as you call it, against Hamas in Gaza, where if ground forces are used, it's not to defeat Hamas, it's just to, to deal with the tunnels and not used again as the first resort. So that brings us to the years that we now see as leading up to October 7th. But can you say something about some of the solutions, or maybe we should say some of the problems that you identified and the solutions in the years in the late 2010s and in the early 2020s? What was the IDF going through that would have continued to happen if it were not for the Hamas invasion in 2023?
We can speak about that in a very general term, in the level of military theory, and we can speak of that in the very practical level of the IDF versus the tenant. In the military theory level, what we've observed is the fact that the last transformation that the IDF had to do with the digital age. 1990s, sensors, computers has allowed this new shape of force that we call surveillance and precision targeting complex. And what it caused is what we talked about. It made the ground forces weaker because the central power went to the arsenals that could fit in a room with computers, air conditioned, and fiber optics. Okay, and so it had its side effects. It meant that our ground forces not only lost trust with the fact that they were expected to go to war and lost many of the investments that they should have had. It was actually objective a situation that they couldn't have what the Air Force could. But we were going into times that technology has allowed it to change. In the 1990s, we were in the third industrial age. In the 2010s, we were now observing the fourth industrial revolution, the fourth industrial age that had to do with what we call now AI and going from networks to mobile networks and so robotics and so on and so forth. And so now you could really have an army aviation, not of jets, but of multiple and cheap drones. You can see
Which emerged not by plan, but kind of by necessity. The units themselves decided, let's buy some drones. Please send us money for drones.
And now everyone knows that the war in Ukraine is the war of drones. But we were observing that back in 2010, 2012. And you can have not just the drone, the aviation, you can have the data processing and the mobile networks that support this complex. So you can have a smart ground maneuver. A smart ground maneuver can actually reveal where the enemy hides. And that was the bottleneck of warfare. Where is the enemy hiding? Ground forces could target the enemy while it was still successful, the enemy, to avoid becoming an Air Force target.
So if I had to sum this up, what I'm hearing is that these enemies, Hamas, Hezbollah, because they fought us all the time, they learned lessons about how to hide, how to break up into diffuse groups. And then that would be a challenge for our ground forces that since they have all the advantages of defenders, we saw how Gaza is a prepared battlefield, they could hit us first, drop into a tunnel, and then all of our advantages, all of our expensive toys wouldn't be able to find them. But you're proposing a technological solution that allows us to find them first and even to hit them first.
Exactly. So ground forces are not do not only enjoy the proximity to the enemy, but they actually corner the enemy into friction. So the enemy can choose whether he flees or fights. And air power does not do that. It doesn't have this effect. So basically, if the enemy went into this sort of rocket and missiles fires while hiding in the underground, your new potential again was a high-tech ground force.
So let me talk about something that we haven't mentioned, which we must, the Iranian threat. Of course, that was something that Israel recognized. That is a threat that is not relevant for the ground forces. It's an intelligence and air force threat. And if I look around the various theaters of this war since October 7th, it seems to me that the areas where the Air Force and intelligence led the fighting, so certainly in Iran, but also in Lebanon, right? The ground forces did a very limited, I think you've called it an engineering operation, but the real taking out the leadership, Nasrallah, Safiya Din, the Radwan leadership, the beepers, all that stuff was intelligence and Air Force. That's where the real successes or the clearer successes have been. Whereas in Gaza, Hamas still controls most of the population, still has its weapons, and still has not given up. So it seems like we really have not yet gotten over this issue where our most effective services continue to not be on the ground.
So let's explore that a bit more. You're right. First, obviously, our excellence in the last decade was focused in air power and intelligence. So there you are. But then again, I mean, I think the 12 Days War is a huge success. But let's go to Lebanon. I've been to Antietam battlegrounds just a month ago. General McClellan, although that was the first northern victory in the war, General McClellan was fired after that battle. He was fired and he was justly fired by Lincoln because after the battle he did not pursue Lee's army. And so the war went on for 2 or 3 more years just because he did not take advantage of the situation. That's a great thing for a military leader. Let's talk about Lebanon. So our excellent complex air power and intelligence has made all those successes that you just mentioned. And Hezbollah back in the autumn of 24 was in the lowest place you can imagine. I couldn't imagine a place as low as the Hezbollah had been in the autumn of 24. And then what is the IDF ground move? There's 2 options. The one option is to pursue the army of the Hezbollah, which is located in the surroundings of the Litani River. He had withdrawn there because of the 1 year long of attrition prior to those events. But the IDF does not pursue with a long move of maneuver into the depth of Lebanon the core of Hezbollah's force. What we actually do is a very small incursion of 2 lines of empty villages, empty because, as I've said, both the citizens and the Hezbollah withdraw from those villages and basically locating the infrastructures and eliminating them, as you say, an engineering operation. And there's a price to that. The price of hesitating with a decisive move is the fact that right now we are probably, or there's a good chance we're heading for another war in Lebanon, another escalation, because Hezbollah is still there and is still rebuilding its force, although it is committed to the armed strike, but he doesn't care about that. So we're paying the price for hesitating of of, of hesitating with our ground forces and not having decisive move. Now, but I want to go back to the point of Iran, and I know we're coming to the end of this podcast. I was talking about the 1990s, and there was a feeling that we are experiencing the ending phases of the Arab-Israeli conflict. But what was really happening that we were in the declining phases in the I'm sorry in the ascent in the rising phases of the Iranian-Israeli conflict. And so the question is the is that military method, this theoretical framework that if we ever need the ground forces to fight, they will be heavily supported by the air tower, is that attainable? Because if now the only force that you can have to fight in long distances, and it's the huge enemy, the Iranians and its other proxies far in the region, you need all the intelligence and all the air power you can get, and all the preparations that they need, which are years long of preparation. So if they're both committed to heavily supporting any ground battle that you have and taking care of Iran, they're too stretched to be effective. And what you actually saw in October 7th is the fact that our defense was very much reliant on an air a response that couldn't be there in the first hours. It's too outstretched. And so the best way for the IDF to really be built for both long-range operation and handling of our enemies around the borders is to have a much more independent, capable ground force that can take care not only of the enemies, but also free up the intelligence and air power resources needed to be focused elsewhere, far away.
And we'll go to a quick break.
What if prayer doesn't work? This question strikes us as a distinctly modern one, an outgrowth of the slow disenchantment of the world. But in truth, the question is an old one, and one given space to breathe here.
Welcome to Thoughts and Prayers. I'm your host, Jessica Fisher. Join me on a deep exploration of the relationship between religion and modernity through personal stories, classical texts, and conversations with leading rabbis, scholars, and educators.
You're almost not supposed to be doing this interview.
Our prayers accumulate on God's doorstep, piled outside like an unimaginably tall stack of letters. We cannot give up on the relationship because God doesn't come to the door as quickly as we may like. So let's keep knocking. Perhaps the gates of compassion will be opened.
Join us every week on Thoughts and Prayers wherever you get your podcasts.
So, just to conclude, I guess we have to ask about what else needs to happen next. You're looking at the lessons of the war in Gaza, the lessons of the 12-day war in Iran, the lessons of the war against Hezbollah, and of course, the ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine. You've mentioned the fact that the ground forces need an independent force that includes an independent army-controlled tactical drone force. Does the IDF need to develop its own missile force? Is that something that you think it needs? What about drone defense? So tell me some of the places where you're urging Israel's military to spend money. We have a lot of funding that's coming through now. Where should we go in the next 10 to 20 years to make sure that we are able to achieve what the army is supposed to do, Israel's security, so we can focus on the things that we want to focus on, aliyah, education, innovation, and the like?
So everything you said is absolutely accurate. We need to have this drone force. We need to have to be much better equipped for tunnel fighting, for the underground fight. We need to have the sensors and data processing capabilities to find those tunnels and enemy hiding elsewhere. We need to have better missiles to have a better fire support, accurate fire support to the ground forces, so we can free up the air force. And what you could see in Iran Well, you could see a missile-dependent doctrine, the Iranian, and a platform-dependent doctrine, the IDF. And I think the platform has won the fight. So I would go for some missiles, but I will not abolish the advantage of a competent air force. But the bottom line is not just what you need to build. The bottom line is the philosophy of it. So right now, what you have in the IDF is two schools of thought. The first one is the air power orthodoxy. And the air power orthodoxy, they think, well, have you seen us in Iran? Have you seen us in Lebanon? So the ground forces is messed up in October 7th, but look at the bigger picture. Keep counting on us. And the other orthodox, of course, that's nonsense. What was proven is that without a competent ground force, not only that you have a problem at war, but eventually you will allow the monsters to rebuild again. But the other orthodoxy says, well, have you seen this air power doctrine fails? What we need now is to go back to the to what we've forgotten, to the big armed ground forces of the 1970s and 1980s. And of course, that nonsense too, because those ground forces, as big as they were, they did not have efficient answers to Hezbollah and Hamas. So after wars, there's a lot of money. So you can have enough money for both orthodoxies to have it their way. And we are heading to an army that is gonna grow again with quantitative, but just might forget about the new qualitative edge needed. So it's not whether you need the missile and the drone, is whether you realize that drone warfare is a new wave, and you understand drones as the new mass of war fighting. And I'm afraid right now we have drones, we have AIs, we have all the gadgets, but we are not invested in a new strategy.
Well, thank you very much, Eran. We could keep talking about this for hours, but unfortunately, we have time limits. Let me just remind everyone to check out his book. Again, The Battle Before the War. Wait, I have it as well. There you go. The Inside Story of the IDF's Transformation. That one was in Hebrew, but it's also out in English. Second prize winner of the INSS Tshetshik Prize for studies on Israeli security. So thank you, Eran, for this conversation.
Thank you, Lazar.
And I also want to thank Amanda Borsheldan, our producer, who I know you guys like to hear her. She is here behind the scenes making this all happen. And to Ari Schlacht, who's going to edit this and make it look clean and enjoyable for you as you hear it with your morning coffee or on your morning run. So thank you for being here. Thank you to Eran and to all of our listeners out there in Israel and around the world. Shalom.